All right, well, like we talked about before the break, after this international break, Arsenal have an interesting run of games that could definitely test Mikel Arteta. Up first is the North London derby, and well, I guess nobody at all has predicted that this is going to be a test for Arsenal. Can anyone, you know what, Nedum, let me come to you. Can you even find some sort of an argument for why Spurs could get something out of this?
Well, according to my prediction, probably not. But I think in the grand scheme of things, I think we're seeing a Spurs side who have shown flashes where they have looked good. But I think one of the issues that they've shown in recent weeks and months is just the fact that there's a lack of creativity. I think at times the defensive side of things is good, but you know, it was only a couple of weeks ago when we were watching them play at home against Chelsea and basically create nothing. And I think for as good as Chelsea say were in that game, we're not exactly looking at them thinking they're this defensive juggernaut and you can't create anything against them. So then when I think about, well, how are they going to play against Arsenal? It just seems like it's going to be a tough day for them because there's certain elements in terms of how Spurs want to play as well, whether it's going to be with the set pieces, with the speed and transition and so on. And I think Arsenal are ready to deal with that. Like a long throw into the box for Arsenal, obviously, unless it's against Sunderland, doesn't tend to bring that many troubles. You know, you could see like a cross into the box from a corner, again, not that many troubles. So I think they're going to be trying to match Arsenal at something which Arsenal are probably better at doing. So yeah, unfortunately, I don't see it going Spurs' way, but it's a derby day, so I guess you could say anything's possible.
I mean, I suppose if you wanted to put some sort of argument up, you would say they're away form. That would be a debate you could put forward, but I think it's been easier for them to play a more defensive game away from home because I think your supporters will accept that a little bit more. I think where they've struggled, and Nedum touched on it, is in some of the home games where you know your fan base isn't going to accept you just sitting camped in the edge of your box, and so they want Tottenham to get out and play a little bit, and they've struggled in a lot of games at doing that. They really have. So I think when they've gone away from home, it's been more of an acceptance that they have kept a good shape and been a bit more difficult to beat. Obviously, City early in the season they played pretty well and won away from home, but I think that's the argument you could put up, but I just see Arsenal would breaking them down in the end.
Yeah, that's the only argument.
Yeah.
There's no pressure on them to go and win this game. The pressure's on Arsenal. They're sitting at the top of the table. They're at home. You know, everything is on them to take the game to Spurs, which Spurs will like, which is why they've done well away from home, because they have been organised and they have a good shape defensively. And at the end of the day, if you keep the opposition out, you just need that one chance, that one spark from somebody. And so that's what Spurs will be talking about. They'll be talking about the last thing we do is open up and play, we keep it solid, and then when we get an opportunity, we have to take advantage of it. That's the only way they win.
All right, well, that's just one of the big games in the Premier League coming up this weekend. But Saturday, Newcastle host Manchester City. And you've heard us bang on about how St. James's Park is quite the fortress. But if you look at the stats, it may not be quite the fortress as Don Hutchison or Shaka Hislop has been saying. At least this season, their only win at home has been to Spurs in the League Cup. They've lost to Liverpool, they've lost to Arsenal, and they've lost to Barcelona in the Champions League. And Nedum, we talk so much about that 12th man at St. James's Park, but welcoming a Manchester City, who's one of the big guns, just like we saw there, that Newcastle actually have lost to. Have we overstated their home advantage a bit too much?
Potentially, yes. I think Newcastle are a side this season, in my opinion, where they we speak about them every so often, but whenever something positive happens, but when it's a little bit more negative, it's quite easy to sort of move on from, because we remember that positive, remember the crowd, remember them in the Champions League, for example, looking good and doing well. And sort of spells within games, like not least of all against that game against Liverpool, or like you could argue a spell against Arsenal. But in reality, I think the way that they started the season domestically isn't as good as Eddie Howe would want at all. And I think they find themselves in this sort of funny position in and around mid-table and not really contesting for those high spots at this moment in time. But I think for them, you know, in some ways, I think Newcastle as a club, as a fan base, for as good as they are, I think they prefer the role of an underdog. So I think that's when people get that sense of the 12th man, get that sense of like nostalgia towards different times for Newcastle where we can all remember the crowd being up and historic results for them. So yeah, I think in some ways it has been overall a disappointing start to the season for them. They've probably not scored enough goals, and even though the defensive is solid in the grand scheme of things, it's not really been exciting. But for them playing against Man City, I think they beat them in the League Cup last year. So it's a great chance for them to potentially springboard into this next part of the season to where there are no international breaks now till March time.
Don't you think don't you think Newcastle are underdogs in this game? Well, the seat I'm sat, I think they are the underdogs. The seat I'm
this
sat,
game?
Aye.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, for sure.
City 100% are going to control most of the game. And this Newcastle, we talk about the Newcastle fan base, they don't need much to get going. All it needs is a turnover and a break, and then they are absolutely on fire. So this, in some ways, will suit City, Newcastle. That's why I've gone for a draw. I don't see how Haaland doesn't score, quite frankly. Nobody's going to be able to stop him. And there's a question mark over City's backline. Yes, I think they've only let 4 goals in the last 7 or 8 games, which would suggest that they're getting better. But this, absolutely, on the break, which is the one thing that City don't like, is exactly what Newcastle's going to do to them. So I think this does suit them. I think Nedum's right. They like being underdogs, and when they're underdogs at home, that crowd doesn't take an awful lot to get behind them.
We talked about this a day or two ago, and it was Shaka actually, and you know, we were talking about their away form, and I said, well, their away form, they're 15th in the league, their home form, they're 14th, which, as you say, their home form hasn't been much better. But Shaka did make the point, and I think there is validity to it, that their performances at home have been better, and they've been close. Now, being close and getting it done are two different things, but they played well against Arsenal, they played well against Liverpool, they played well for a good hour or so against Barcelona until Pedri and De Jong took control of the game, but they were very competitive. Now, at some point you have to get over the line. So I think there is some argument to that away from home they've had the struggles, haven't played particularly well. At home they haven't got the results, but they've played some good football. Now they've got to take that to the next step. Can they do it this weekend? I mean, again, I've gone for a draw. I could have went, you know, I was a draw or I was a City win. That's kind of where I am, because, you know, going forward at the moment, City look the real deal. And although we've talked about them defensively, as Stevie said, they haven't shipped a lot of goals, and I've just loved young Nico O'Reilly's performances at left back. Absolutely love watching that young guy play. But it is a close one, and I think, you know, we had an interview with Voltemada yesterday, and he looks quite comfortable in a Newcastle jersey. They are a side that can cause you a lot of problems. They're not going to just sit on the back foot for the bulk of the game. So I think this is actually going to be a real good game, and a big test of City's back four, to be honest.
Well, Nedum, I think you slightly agree there, because you've gone for a Manchester City win, but you have them conceding 2 goals.
Slightly agree.
Well, because he's gone for the City win and you went for the draw. But obviously, Nedum, that backline at City is a concern for you in this one.
No, to be honest, I don't see it as a concern in that manner, because I think they defend in a sort of different way. And I think even though, you know, people have a sense that the defence isn't as good as it needs to be, I think their defensive record this season, I think it's either 2nd or 3rd best in the league. So clearly something's going well for them. But I think the point I wanted to make there was about this game for Newcastle. Like, Newcastle could win the game against Man City. The score could be anything. But from a Newcastle perspective, there has to be consistency, because even in the way that we're talking about them now in this last few minutes, we're almost affording them the chance to, like, you know, we're sort of whitewashing their inconsistencies. Because as crazy as it may sound, I just had a look at the table then. They're 1 point ahead of Leeds United, 2 points ahead of Burnley, 3 points ahead of West Ham. And these are 3 clubs who we're looking at saying, well, you know, they're not having a great season. So I think from a Newcastle perspective, yes, it's great that you can get up for these big games where you are the underdog, even though you're amongst 50, 60,000. But for a side that's playing in the Champions League, you can't really be looking at sort of 12 points, whatever it is, from 12 games and say, you know, that is going to be enough.